In this video, I'm going to show you how to work with the SQLite database that comes with Android. So we're just going to do a simple example to demonstrate how to do or how to work with the SQLite database. So for my example, I want to just basically create a view where the user will enter his name or enter a name and a cell phone number, and we're just saving people. So this is really just going to be a simple example, but to basically show you how an SQL database works. So I'm going to start off with a linear layout and set then the Android orientation property to vertical. Okay, I'm going to remove this text view. And then when we go back to design, you will have a clear design, but the linear layout will now be vertical. So I'm going to drag in just two simple text fields. So I'm going to drag in a plain text field, and for the cell number, maybe a phone text field or an edit text. Okay, so we've got those two. Then I'm going to drag in 4 buttons that we're going to use for this example. There's a button, 1, 2, 3, 4 buttons. Okay, so for all of these buttons, I'm going to set the width property to match the parent, and then I'm going to set the margin property on all of these. So layout margin left, I'm going to make it 30, and the right I'm going to make it 30 as well. So we'll have something that looks like this. For this button, let's put the top one also 10 dp, just to move it a bit down. Okay, now we need to set the text on these components. So I'm going to go to the strings XML. So under resources, values, strings XML, let's set up those names quickly. So we're going to use one that says, or the name will be the hint for the name that you're going to type there. So we're going to just say, please enter name. The second one will be hint cell number or hint cell. And then we're going to say, please enter cell number. Then the next one will be for the submit button. So we're going to say btn underscore submit. And then we're just going to say the text will be submit. Then for the next button, it will be the show data button. So we're going to just say show underscore data. And then just put the string there, show data. Then the next one, string name equals btn. It will be edit data. And just say edit data. And then again, string name equals btn delete data. And it will be delete data. Okay, so I think we've set up all of the text that we're going to use. I'm going to close down strings XML. And now if we go back to the layout, we can set up the hints for these two. So if we just click on that one and we go down to the hint property, 3 dots, we're going to go to hint and we're going to say hint name. And then for that one also the hint, but this one's this hint cell. And then for all of the buttons, so for the new the first button there, we're going to have the text btn submit. So it's just going to be submit. And then for that one, it will be the show data one. For the next button, double click, we're going to use the edit data one, this one. And then for the last button, it's going to be delete data. So we're going to use delete data. Okay, so that's setting up all of our buttons. Now these two, let's just make sure that they are centered. So we're going to go to the normal gravity property and then go to center horizontal. And now it looks good. So let's just set some IDs and some methods for the buttons. So for these two, we're going to set up IDs. So I'm going to call this one ET name. And I'm going to call that one ET cell. Okay, so we've got ET name and we've got ET cell. And then let's go and set up the methods quickly. So I'm going to set up the methods, public void. First one is going to be btn submit. And we're just going to have view v in brackets. And then for the next one, it will be public void btn show data. And then for this one, it will be public void btn edit data. And then the last one will be delete data. It's going to be public void btn delete data. And then we've created all of the methods that we're going to use. Now, before we go and set up the methods, let's just declare that edit texts as well. Remember, we call them ET name and ET cell. Just remember those two, ET name and ET cell. So we've declared them. Let's just initialize them quickly. ET name equals edit text, find the view by its ID, r.id. And then we're going to go with ET name for the first one. And then ET cell for the second one, which will also be an edit text, and it's going to be ET cell. Okay, so the two edit texts are set up nicely. Let's just go and set up these methods to the buttons. So if I click on the first button, submit, let's just go to the onClick property. There's the onClick property, and the first one will be btn submit. The second one will be btn show data. The third one, edit data, search for btn edit data. And then the last one will be delete data, and it will be that one. Okay, so now we've set up the whole thing. Both of these edit texts are set up in coding, as well as all of the methods for our buttons. Okay, so now the next thing that we want to do is to go and create a new activity, so that when we click on show data, it will actually go to a new activity and show us the data from the database. So we need to go and create a new activity. So on your folder, in the Java folder, in your package folder there, we're going to right click there and say new and activity, and then we're going to go to empty activity. And I'm going to call this activity, let me just resize this thing quickly. We're going to call that activity, let's just call it data. And then you can say finish. So we've got a new activity called data, and then in the layout folder, we've also got data there, activity data. Okay, so let's just go and set up that activity data quickly. Basically, the only thing that we're going to have there is one text view. I'm just going to change that to a linear layout. That is vertical. So if you go down to design or back to design, just an empty view, and I'm going to add a simple medium text there, just on the left hand side, and we're going to go into our strings XML and just set the text for that one. And we're going to say, let's just say data. We're going to say something like data from the database will be displayed here. Okay, so if we go back to activity data, we can just double click that one and set the text to data. Okay, so data from the database will be displayed here. So that's basically where we're going to set the data. So I want to have a text view. For this text view, we need an ID. So I'm going to say TV data. And let's go to data and set up that text view. So we're going to say text view TV data, and then set them up, or set it up in the on create. So it's going to be TV data equals text view, find the view by its ID, and connect to TV data. So now it's connected, so we can actually go and set the text into that one. And in the main activity, we can go and say, well, when we want to go to BTN show data, we can just go and say start activity. And then in brackets, we're going to say new intent. You can have Alt Enter for the import. First argument, your context, which is just this. And then the second one is that data class that we want to call. And that will start the new activity. So when the guy then clicks on show data, it's going to go to the data activity, which will just basically be this one. And now we can set the text to it later on. Okay, so that's setting up the second activity. Okay, in order to do the next part, we need to actually go and create a Java class that will help us to build a database. So our database will look something like this, and I like to compare a database with an Excel workbook and all of its tabs there at the bottom and different rows and columns. So basically, we've got a database called contacts database, which could be your whole workbook. And then every table in your database you could see as the tabs at the bottom of an Excel spreadsheet. That's the tab, so that would be your tables. And then inside of every table, we've got columns and we've got rows. So we will basically create a database that looks like this. The database name will be contacts database. We're going to create a contacts table, and in that table, we will create just 3 columns. So there will be a column for the guy's ID, or maybe just a simple ID that will auto increment. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And then there's going to be a name for the guy, and there's going to be a cell phone number for the guy. So this is basically what we need to create in order for our database to work for this example. So I hope you understand this simple example of Excel. So let's go back to Android Studio, and then we're going to change or create a new Java file. So under Java, in your project folder, you're going to right click and say new Java class. And we're going to call this class contacts DB, contacts database. So if you open up the class, it just looks like this. And we don't need to extend anything. We're just going to use the class as it is. And then hopefully this class will help us to build our application or our database. So we need to have some fields at the beginning. So we're going to say public static final, and we're going to have string, and we're going to have key row ID. Now remember the 3 columns that we had now in the Excel spreadsheet. If I can quickly just go back to that one, we have an ID, a name for the guy, and the cell phone number. So that's what I'm trying to do here. So the first one will be the ID, the row ID, and I'm going to use it as ID. That's the first column name. Then the second column name, public static final string, and I'm going to have key name, and then that column name we said should be person underscore name. And then we're going to create the next column, so it's going to be public static final string, and that one will be key cell. And then we're just going to declare it same as the Excel spreadsheet one with an underscore. Now, very important, it will give you a problem if you do not use this underscore. So for something that does not have an underscore in it, like for instance person name, just make sure that you actually include an underscore. For somewhat odd reason, this doesn't work if you do not include the underscores. So please make sure that you add the underscore. So if you look at that Excel spreadsheet, we've created names for those three columns: ID, person name, and cell. Okay, so they are constants, and we're going to use those constants, but that's basically the three names for those three specific columns. Then the next one we're going to create will be our database name. So I'm going to say private final string, and I'm going to say database underscore name, and the database name will be contacts database. Then we're going to also have a private final string for the database table, the name of the table, and the name of the table will be contacts table. So you can see in our Excel spreadsheet, the name of the database is contacts database, and then we're going to work in the contacts table, and inside of that table we've got rows and columns, where the column names will be these. Okay, so just a simple example. So we need to have the database name and the database table name, and then a last one that we need is basically the database version. So for the version, we're just going to use an integer there, and we're going to say database underscore version, and obviously we start at version number 1. Okay, and then we're going to have some variables that we need to declare, so we're going to have private DB helper, and we're going to create that class now. So this one is going to give us a problem. So it's private DB helper, our helper. Then it's going to be private final context, which we're just going to say our context. Okay, so it's just to get the class that is using this specific database of ours. And then context, you can use Alt Enter for your import there. We're going to check those errors now. It might not have been initialized. We're going to do that now. And then we're going to have private SQLite database. So android.database.sqlite, choose that one. So it's SQLite database, and we're going to say our database. So basically these declarations will help us later on. So just declaring those, we will get back to them as we get to the coding part. Okay, and now the next thing that we need to do is to create our constructor for this class. So we're going to say public contacts DB, a constructor for the class, and this constructor will basically just take the context. So basically just the class that's using this specific class of ours. So normally it will just be the specific activity that you pass in this. Okay, so it's just the context there, and the context that we created there, our context, we will set our context to this context that was passed through. Okay, so our constructor has been created, and now we're going to create this very important inner class, which will be called DB helper. Okay, so this class will be a private class. So we're going to say private class DB helper, and we're going to say extends SQLite open helper, SQLite open helper. Okay, and then when we open up the method, or the class, then if you hover over it, you can see that it says the DB helper must either be declared abstract or implement the method, the abstract method on create, which accepts an SQLite database in brackets. So we're going to go to code, override methods, and search for those on create method, which accepts an SQLite database. And you're going to say OK. And then you'll see it's got another error there. It must also have the on upgrade method. So again, go to code, override methods, and go and choose the on upgrade method, this one, and say OK. And then if you hover over it again, you can see there's no default constructor available. So we need to create a constructor for this class. So the constructor for this class will just be public DB helper, and then again we're just going to pass in the context. But this time we're going to send this to the superclass of the SQLite Open Helper. So it's going to be the context, passing in the context that was passed through, this one there. The second argument will be your database name so that we can create the database. So the database name, the second argument null, and then the third argument will be the database version. So then this constructor will basically construct a new database. Now the interesting thing here is that if, or the onCreate, this onCreate method, which we're going to do now, is only run when the database file did not exist and was just created. So if the constructor runs and it creates the database name with a specific database version, it's going to run the onCreate to start building your whole database with its tables and its columns and everything, which we're going to do now. So the onCreate is only run when the database file did not exist and was just created. If the onCreate returns successfully, which means it doesn't throw an exception, the database is assumed to be created with the requested version number that you specified. This onUpgrade method is only called when the database file exists, but the stored version number is lower than requested in the constructor. Okay, so let's just go quickly. I'm going to go through that again, what I just said. So let's go to creating the database inside of our onCreate. And then when we're done with that part, as well as done with the onUpgrade, I'll just go through it again to make sure that you understand. So the first one there, what we want to do is to basically do the following thing. I'm just going to add a comment there just to get the simple Java part correct. So what we want to go and do is to create a new table in our database. So we're going to say create table, and we're going to have that contacts table in SQL now, and then the table will be the ID. First column will be ID, and that column will be an integer. It will also be the primary key, and it should also auto increment. Okay, so that's basically the code that we want to place. The second argument, just going to go to a new line. The second, I'm sorry, not the second argument, the second column, that's the first column. The column, remember, we're creating a table called contacts table. The first column will be called ID. It will be an integer, it will be the primary key, and it will auto increment. And then the second one, or the second column that we're going to use is that person name of ours. That's the second column, and that will be text, and it will be not null, so it cannot contain null values. Then we're going to say a comma again, and then the next one will be underscore cell, the cell number column, and then we're going to also say text not null, and then we're going to close it off and end it off. So this is the SQL query basically, or the SQL statement in order to create our database for us. So we're going to create a new table in this database name for this version called contacts table, with the first column being ID. It's going to be integer, primary key, auto increment. The second column person name, text not null. The third column cell, text not null, and you can keep on adding columns here now. So that's the text that we want to have. But in Java it works a bit different, so we just need to go and do this the correct way. So we need to go and have a string that we're going to declare. So I'm going to say string SQL code equals, and now I'm going to try to recreate what we did here but in Java coding. So we're going to say create table, and then a space, and then we're going to use our database table as we declared it at the top, which will basically be contacts table. So we're going to create that table. Then after contacts table there must be a space and then the bracket. So we're going to have a space and then the bracket. Okay, let me just go to a new line there. And then after that we need to have the first column name, which is underscore ID, but we called underscore ID key row ID. So I'm going to say key row ID, okay, and then a space again, and then integer primary key auto increment. So it's going to be integer primary key auto increment. Okay, hope you're okay with that one. And then we need to place a comma there, which is still fine. We can place a comma and then a space, and then again the next column name. So I'm going to go to a new line. The next column name will be key name, again a space, and then we're going to have text not null. So it's going to be text not null. Then a comma, you can see the comma there, comma, and then the next column name. A space, and a column, a space, and then the next column name. So there's the comma and the space, and then the next column name will be key cell, and that one will also be text not null. So you can see there after cell there's a space and then text not null. So there's the space, text not null, and then we end it off with a bracket that closes and the semicolon that closes. So that's very important. And then our Java code should also close with a semicolon. So just make sure that you're okay with this part. Remember, that's what we want to accomplish, and we did it in coding like this. And then just to execute the query, remember that in the onCreate there's a database, an SQL database that will be passed through. So we're just going to say the DB, that specific one, dot execute SQL code for me. Which SQL code? Well, this one that we created there. So it's going to execute this one. As soon as it executes this SQL code, we're going to create this new table with the name database table, with these columns, and with those properties for each column. So that's the onCreate. So just remember that the onCreate only runs when the database gets created the very first time. So by using this DB helper class, we're creating a database with this name and the version, and then the onCreate will directly run. OnUpgrade will not run unless you change the database version. If I run this and I go and change the database version to a 2, it's going to go directly to OnUpgrade, and then we're going to do something in OnUpgrade. Okay, so basically in the OnUpgrade method, we're going to do the following. We're just going to say, you can also see there's a database that's passed through. So we're going to say that database dot execute SQL, and we're going to do the following. We're just going to say drop the table if it exists, and then indicate the table name. So it's going to be database table. Okay, so basically when we upgrade the database, when we change the database version, we can drop the table totally and then create a new table. So how do we create a new table? We just call the onCreate method again. And then remember, this onCreate accepts a database, so we're going to pass in that DB again. So basically when onUpgrade runs, we're going to drop the table, delete the whole table, and then call onCreate again to recreate the table for us. That's if you change the database version. So obviously if you want to save the previous data of your table, when onUpgrade runs, you need to do that before you drop this table. Okay, so that's just the job of the onUpgrade method. And next we need to do some really important methods. So after this DB helper class of ours, I'm just going to click on that bracket to see where it ends. After that class, we're going to create some very important methods. So the first method that we need to create is the open method. So we're going to say contacts DB and then open, and this method will be throwing an SQL exception. And then inside of this method, we're going to declare, or we're just going to initialize our helper that we declared there at the top. So you can see we've got DB helper, our context, and our database. Okay, so let's go down to the bottom again. So in this open method, this method will help us to open up the database so that we can start reading or writing, reading from it, writing to it. So this open method, we're going to say our helper that we declared at the top will be a new instance of this inner class. So we're going to say new DB helper, and we're going to say our context. So now remember, when we pass in this, it's going to go to this constructor, passing in the context, which is our context. It will go to the database name and the database version, as if your database version actually differs from the one that's currently saved on the phone, it's going to run on upgrade. Okay, if the database does not exist at all, it's going to run on create. But if the database exists and the database version did not change, everything will just stay the same. We're just basically opening it up. Okay, so then our helper equals new DB helper, our context. Then we're going to say our database, which we declared at the top. We said our database, which is an SQL database, equals our helper dot get writable database, so that we can actually start writing or reading from the database. And then we're just going to say return this. Okay, so then the next method will be the close method. So we're just going to say public void close. And in this close method, we're just going to say our helper dot close. So that will just be closing the database. So we're going to call open to open up the database, close to close the database. Okay, so then the next methods is the methods that will help us to basically create a new entry, retrieve the data that's currently in the database, delete the data, and updating the data. So these methods you can actually go and create and name whatever you want. So I'm just going to create 4 methods to quickly explain those specific instances that we could possibly get. So I'm going to start with the create entry one. So I'm going to return a long value, and I'm going to explain that now. And we're going to say create entry. Now remember, you can name this method anything you like. So for our create entry, we need to have a name for the guy, and remember, we need to have a cell phone number. Okay, we have 3 columns. The first column is just an ID, but remember, we said that ID will auto increment. So you'll see in the database will automatically give us a value for that one. So the first guy you enter to the database will start with 1, and then it's going to auto increment for every next one or every other person that you add to the database. And then we've got a name and a cell phone column. So we're asking for the name and the cell phone, and then we can basically add a new entry to the database using that name and cell phone. So what we need to do is to go to a class that is called content values. So this content values class will help us with key value pairs, so that we can add those key value pairs to the database. So we're going to say CV, or whatever you want to call it, equals new content values with nothing in brackets. And then we're going to say CV, that content values, dot put. So there's a put method, and this put method takes a key and a value. So the key, again, is just a specific name for the data that you want to save. In this case, we want to use the column name. So the column name in this case will be key name. That's the name of the column, key name. And then the second argument will actually be the value that you want to save in that column. And the value that I want to save is name. Okay, and then we're going to also say cv.put. Again, the first argument, basically your key. So in this case, it will be our column name again. So our column will be key cell. And then the second argument will be the cell phone number that we want to save there. So you can basically see I'm indicating the column name and then the value I want to save in that column. Remember, we are creating a new row. So it's like this Excel spreadsheet. We'll be creating this new row. This ID column will be auto incremented every time. So we're adding the person, the Jack Porter in the person name, and the cell phone number in the cell phone column. Okay, so we're passing in Jack Porter and the cell phone number. And so in the person name column, we're going to save the name, and in the cell phone column, we're going to save the cell phone. Okay, and then when you're done, we need to return. So we're going to say return our database dot insert, and the insert method will actually insert data to your database. So we're going to say insert to the database table, second argument null, third argument whatever you want to place in there. So we're going to pass in the CV, which is the content values that holds these two values for the specific columns. So I think this one is quite easy. Now the insert method returns the number of values that you've inserted to the database. So you can see then that's why we have the long there. We could also insert a lot of values, so that's why we use a long there instead of an int. But in this case, for our create entry method, we'll actually only insert one. Okay, but this is just an example of how you could do a create entry. So this one actually only adds one entry to the database. Okay, so the second one, that's create entry then. The second one will be to get the data back from the user or back from the database. Okay, so for this one, we're going to say public, and remember you can name this method also just what you like. So I'm going to say public string get data, and I'm going to return a string, but if you want to return an array list with data or whatever you want, you can also do that. So I'm just going to return a normal string, and let me just say return null at this stage so that we don't have that error. Okay, so what we want to do, the first thing when you try to retrieve data from your database, you need to indicate which columns do you want to retrieve. So I'm going to choose the columns in an array. So you need to use an array. So I'm going to say columns equals a new string array, and then we're going to initialize that array with the column names. So the column names that I want is the row ID. I'm going to show the ID, and then the second one is the name, and then the third one will be the cell phone number. So I'm just indicating which of the columns do I want to return in this specific getData method. So in this case, I'm returning the values in every one of the columns. So this columns array indicates which of the columns do you want to retrieve. So in this case, I want to retrieve all three the columns, or the values in all three of the columns. Okay, so the next thing is we need to go and create a cursor object in order to move the cursor. So basically what we want to do is to go and set the cursor at a specific position and start reading at that position. Okay, so we're going to set up a cursor object. So it's going to be cursor, whatever you want to call it, equals our database dot query, and then we're going to need to add or to indicate the database table name. So that's just database table. The second argument is the columns that you want to use, and the columns will be this string array that we're going to use. And then for all the rest, you can see there's a lot of selection arguments, group by, having, order by. So you can set values for all of those, but for this example, I'm just going to set null there. I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. Okay, so that's just creating a new cursor inside of this table with selecting these columns. So then the cursor object has been created, and now we can start retrieving the data. So I'm going to say string result equals, and then we're going to start off the result. Now, before we go to the for loop that will run us through the data, we need to go and get the index for every row. So if I, sorry, not for every row, for every column. So if I go to the columns, you'll see that this column is at a specific index. So it could be a 0 or a 1. And then the next one, let's say this one is at index 1, then this one will be at index 2, and that one will be at index 3. So you need to get that specific index in order to retrieve the data. So in order to do that, we're going to say int I row. So the index for the row ID. Let's say row ID. The index for the row ID column. So that will be the first column basically. Okay, in order to get that, we're going to say that cursor that's now got a connection to our database table and it got a connection to those columns. And then we're going to say dot get column index. So you're going to say get column index and then indicate the name of the column that you want to get the index of. And that's key row ID. So I'm now getting the index, and remember that could be a 1 or a 2 or whatever the index for that specific column. I get the index for the column, and now I need to get the index for all of these in order to retrieve the values in those columns. So I'm going to say int I, now the next one will be the name column, equals c.get column index, again key, in this case name, and then I'm going to say int I, other column is called cell, and then I'm going to say c.get column index, and I want to get the index for the cell column. So now that I've got the index, I know where that specific column is. I know the index of the columns. We can now start extracting the data. So to extract the data, we need a normal for loop. Now a for loop has got basically three values that we need to set. So the first one is the initialization, the second one is the test, and the third one is the increment. So I'm sure you're going to understand this for loop quite easily. So the first one will be c dot, so we're going to take the cursor and we're going to move the cursor to the very first item. So that's just initializing it, starting right at the top. So we're moving the cursor to be at the very first one. Move to first. So that would be the cursor. Cursor will be pointing to this one then. Okay. And then the second argument is normally the test part. So we're going to say c dot is after last, but we're going to put a not there. So this for loop must run while the cursor is not after the last one. So remember, after the last one would be at a row where there's no data anymore. And then we want to stop. Okay, so cursor dot is after last then, and then the last one is to increment it. So we're just going to say c dot move to next, and that's incrementing the for loop. Okay, so let's see what we're going to do then inside of this. Now remember, we've set up result there, so I'm going to say result equals that result again, or the previous value of result, plus, and now the cursor is at a specific row. Every time the for loop runs, the cursor is at a specific row. Okay, so what do we need to do? We need to say c dot get string, and then I need to indicate the index. You can see there it gives us a hint there, the column index. So the column index that we want to return is called I row ID for the very first one. So I'm going to retrieve the string value inside of that row ID column. Remember, the cursor is at that specific row, but I'm retrieving using the get string method. I'm retrieving that specific column's value, which it will be the 1. Okay, that's the row ID, and then I'm going to add, let's just add a colon there, and then we're going to say c.getString again, but this time we want to get the name of the guy, so I'm going to say iname there. So now it's going to go, it's still standing still at that specific position, but now it's going to retrieve the name of that guy. Okay, and then after the name, we can go and say, well, please give us the cell phone number as well. So let's just put a space there, and then we're going to say, I'm just going to go to a new line, then we're going to say c.getString I cell, which will get the cell phone number of the guy. And then we can just add a new line character there so that we can keep on adding all of the values inside of the database. Okay, so that's basically it for this method. Last thing that we need to do, if we're done using the cursor, we just need to close it so it frees up the memory for the cursor. It doesn't exist in memory anymore, and then we can just return the result. So this getData method will then return the result. And remember, you could have had a class created with an array list where you create an instance of the class, place it in an array list, and at the end you return the array list. This is just a simple example where we are returning basically a string value. Okay, so the next method that we're going to do will be the delete entry method. So we're going to say public, and again I'm going to use long delete entry. Remember, you can name the method whatever you like, remove entry or whatever. And then I'm going to pass in the row ID to delete. Okay, and then this one is very easy. We're just going to say return our database dot delete, and then in brackets you can see there we need to have a table name, a where clause, and then some where arguments. Okay, so we're going to say delete, first one, the database table name, the second one, the where clause. So we're going to say where the key row ID is equal to, and then I'm going to add a question mark there. And then for the third argument is the value that I want to add. So I'm going to say new string array, and then I'm going to include the row ID that was passed in there, and then just close it off. So basically what's going to happen here is we're going to pass in this row ID. That row ID will be the value that's passed into the string array, and then we're going to delete in this database table where the row ID is equal to, and the question mark will be replaced by the value inside of the string array. So we're basically deleting in the database table where the row ID is the specific ID, and then it will delete it. Okay, so that's the delete method. The next method that we're going to do is the public long, and remember this one will also then return the number of elements that you deleted. In this case, we're only deleting one, so it will return a 1 after deleting. But if you want to delete more than one inside of that string array, you are more than welcome to do so, and that's why we have the long there. So we're going to say update entry for the next method. And for this one, we're going to pass in the string, the row ID for that specific one. We want to see which ID we need to change. And then we're going to pass in the name, and we're going to also pass in the cell phone number of the guy that we want to update. And now this one, again, we need to go and create some content values. So we're going to say content values CV equals new content values, like we did when we created one there at the top in the create entry, exactly the same thing. So we create or basically place the changed values now. So we're going to say cv.put again, and then in the name column we're going to place the name that the guy entered there, and then in the, what is the other one, key cell, in the cell column we're going to place this changed cell phone value that the guy entered. So again, we're just setting up the content values. cv.put will put in the column name this name that was passed through, and in the cell phone column it will put the cell phone number that was passed through. And now we're just going to say return our database dot update, and then again we're going to indicate the database table name, the values that we want to update, which will be these column name. If you only want to update one column, you will just add one put method there. Okay, so the column name, and then the content values, and then the third argument will be your where clause again. So we're going to say where the key row ID again is equal to a question mark, the same as we did above there, and then the second argument will be again a new string array, and we're going to initialize that with the row ID that was passed through. Okay, so basically the same thing again. we're updating the database table, this specific database table. We are changing these columns, these values in these columns, where the row ID is the row ID that you indicated, which will be the one that was passed through there. So then we are updating a new entry. So this is basically our contactsdb.java class, and this is the one that we use in order to do our database. So I hope you're okay with this class. The next part we will do is to go back to all of our activities and see how this works. Okay, so let's go back to our, I'm just going to close some of these. I'm going to close those. Let's go to the main activity. So in the main activity, in the btn submit, so if the guy is entered now, let me just open up that main again. The guy will come and he will enter his name, or you as the user will enter a name and a cell phone number and then click on submit. So what do we want to do in submit? The first thing we want to do is to get those two values. So we're going to say string name equals etname dot getText dot toString, and then if you want, you can also add the trim method there to make sure that the user did not add any white space, so just removing the white space. So we're going to say also string cell phone number equals etcell dot getText dot toString, and also calling the trim method to just make sure that he did not add a space there or something like that. And then when we want to try to read from the database, we need to have this try catch statement, because it could throw an SQL exception. Okay, so we're going to go to catch and in brackets SQL exception, and whatever you want to call that exception object. Now it will give us an error because we did not actually type any code there that could throw the exception. So now in order to use this contactsDB class of ours, we're going to say contactsDB, whatever you want to call it, equals new contactsDB, and remember that it accepts a context in the brackets, so we're just going to pass in this. Okay, and then we're going to say this database, we're going to call the open method, which will open up the database. And then we must remember to also go and say db.close to close the database at the end. And now we can go and create a new entry. So we can go and say db. We have a method called create entry, and we're just passing in the name and the cell phone number as according to that method. So remember our create entry method. There it is. It accepts the name and the cell phone number, and it inserts it to the database. So that's basically what we did there. Just passing in the name and the cell phone number, and it will add it to the database. And then we can just display a toast to tell the user that we have actually got, or it's successfully saved, or whatever you want. So I'm going to say successfully saved. And then after that, we could also just set that etname.setText and just clear it again. And the same for etcell.setText and setting it to nothing just to clear it. Okay, and then when we catch the exception, we can just do a simple toast again, and then maybe just show that message. So I'm going to say, instead of hard coding text there, I'm just going to say e.getMessage. So whatever the exception message will then be displayed to the screen. So that's how you then add something to the database, something new to the database. Because we already created this create entry method, it's easy to just pass it along. So basically, we create a new instance of the class. We call the open method to open up the database. Then you can use any of your methods to change, create, or delete, and then you need to close. Okay, so the next method, the btn show, will just go to when the guy clicks on the show data button. It's just going to go to the data activity, which we're going to do now, and then edit data and delete data we're going to quickly have a look at also. So let's go back to the main activity and then btn edit data. So let's see how we can go and edit some data. So again, we're going to use a try and a catch block. And again, it's going to be an SQL exception that will be caught there. And we can just show the toast quickly there again. Let me just go to that one. And again, just say e.getMessage. Okay. And then here again, we can just go and open up that or create a new instance of the contacts DB. And passing in the context, just this, the class. Again, we can go and open up the database. And then just remember to also add .close. And then we can go and update an entry. So we can go and say db.update an entry. And remember, the first argument is the row ID. So I'm just going to put a simple example here. Let's say we want to change the very first row, or the first value, and we want to change it to, so let's say currently in the database we've got Jack Porter, and we want to change that to something else. So I'm going to change it to my own name. And then the third argument is the cell phone number. So let's just say 278456734455, something like that. So I'm changing the values of the first entry, and that's how it will work. And then we can also just display a toast there. And that toast will also just say something like successfully updated. Okay, so that's the method that we're going to use. Update entry, opening up the database, updating the entry, and then closing the database. And then the last method that we're going to do there is btn delete data. So we're going to say also try and a catch there in order to get this one to work. So it's going to be try catch, again an SQL exception, E. I'm just going to copy that one there. And let's just paste it there. And then let's see how this one works. Also, you need to create a new instance of our database. So it's going to be new contacts DB, just pass in this. And then we need to open up the database again, close the database again somewhere, and then in between we can delete data. So we can say db.delete an entry, and we only need to indicate the row ID. So I can go and say I want to delete that entry number 1, and it will delete entry number 1 from the database. So that's basically it. Let's just add a toast there. And again, we're just going to say successfully deleted this time. Okay, successfully deleted or something like that. So this is just a simple example on how to use your database class. And then the last thing that we can go and do is to go back to our data class and see how can we retrieve the data from the database. Remember, there's one last method, get data, that we didn't use yet, which will return the result of all the data in the database. So let's go and have a look at how we can do that. Okay, so for this one, again, we need to have the try and the catch block there when we're trying to open up the database. So it's going to be a try and the catch. And again, it will be an SQL exception. And then we're going to say the toast again. And we're just going to say e.getMessage. Okay, so here again, we're just going to call, or just going to open up the database. So we're going to say context db equals new context db, passing in the context. And then we open up the database. So we open it up. And remember to close it, and then in between we can get the data. So basically what we want to do is to set the data from the database directly to that text view, and the text view is called TV data. So I'm going to say TV data.setText, and then we're going to set the text as db dot and calling that method get data. Now remember, get data will return a string which will be that result from the for loop. Okay, so then the data is set and everything is done. So that's basically it for this project. I hope you understand basically the important file is this one, the contacts DB file where you create, delete entries, updating entries, and so forth. And that's the one that you need to understand. So please go through this one again. We will run the application now to see if everything works as planned. Okay guys, let's just have a quick look at this application. If you run the application, we can enter a name. So I'm just going to just enter Chuck Norris there. And then we can also enter a telephone number. And then when we click on submit, it says successfully saved. And then when we click on show data, you can see that that is actually in the database. We go back and we can enter another name. Let's say Peter Pan. And we're going to enter his cell phone number and then say submit. And show data, you can see the second entry is also then added. And now we can also go and say edit data, which will actually put the first entry, will change the whole first entry to Johan Urius. We can also go back and click on delete data, which will delete the first entry. So if we go and click to show data, the first entry is deleted. Okay, so both of the delete and the edit methods actually works. If we go to our app settings, so if you go to settings of your phone and go to apps, and you scroll down to that SQL application that we just did, and you click on that application, you can see there's storage, and then you can see the amount of space that it takes up. If you click on clear the data, it removes the database for your specific app. So if I go back to my app and I click on show data, I will see nothing. Okay, so we can enter something again. Let's say Johan with the telephone number and say submit. And if we go click on show data, you can see data exists in the database again. So go back to settings and you can see that we've got 80 kilobytes of data that's been used again.